There is a profound esoteric framework detailing 7 distinct levels of human consciousness, suggesting a fascinating, almost paradoxical phenomenon. It proposes that the vast majority of individuals who dedicate their lives to spiritual development, mindfulness, and the pursuit of enlightenment become permanently trapped at level 3. The irony of this philosophical architecture is that this trap is brilliantly disguised as awakening itself. Today, we are breaking down the complete structural architecture of this entire 7-level system. We will analyze how consciousness theoretically evolves from basic survival imperatives to complete universal integration, and critically examine the psychological mechanics behind the so-called seeker's trap. Please note, right from the start, that this is an interpretive and symbolic analysis of esoteric, Gnostic, and Eastern mystical philosophies. It is not a statement of historical consensus, religious dogma, or hard empirical science. By the 7 levels of consciousness, I mean a conceptual roadmap found across various ancient and modern esoteric traditions that categorizes the evolution of human awareness. It is fundamentally not a physical location, a biological progression, or a destination after death, but rather a psychological and perceptual framework. It maps the internal cognitive journey from a highly localized, restricted egoic state to a condition of boundless, non-dual awareness, which classical texts often refer to as the monad, the pleroma, or the absolute. It works like this. The primary mechanism of progression through these 7 levels relies entirely on the continuous shifting of the core identity. It is not about acquiring new information, but about changing the fundamental lens through which reality is perceived. Step 1 involves thoroughly understanding the baseline conditions of humanity, which are defined as levels 1 and 2. Level 1 is characterized universally as survival consciousness. This is pure, unreflective biological awareness. The psychological parameters at this stage are strictly limited to sustenance, physical safety, territorial defense, and biological reproduction. There is virtually no self-reflection, no existential anxiety, and no philosophical inquiry into the nature of being. In this theoretical model, consciousness at level 1 is entirely bound to the physical form, operating on automatic neurological imperatives and ancient evolutionary programming. It is the consciousness of pure instinct. Step 2 represents the transition into ego consciousness, and it is crucial to understand that this is where the overwhelming majority of modern human society currently operates. At level 2, consciousness develops a highly complex, rigid sense of self. It constructs a detailed narrative avatar composed of a legal name, a personal history, cultural conditioning, political affiliations, and social status. The defining characteristic of level 2 is total, unquestioned identification with this psychological construct. The individual completely believes, without a shadow of a doubt, that they are their stream of thoughts, their spontaneous emotional reactions, and their physical body. The primary mechanism of suffering at this level is rooted in the constant, exhausting defense of this fragile psychological avatar against external threats, social judgments, and the inevitable reality of physical decline. The ego constantly builds walls to protect its constructed identity, perceiving the universe as a fragmented collection of separate, often hostile objects competing for finite resources. Step 3 is where the architecture of this esoteric framework becomes highly complex, introducing the concept of seeking consciousness. This stage is universally recognized by spiritual communities as the beginning of a profound awakening. An individual organically transitions into level 3 when they begin to deeply question the fundamental nature of reality and look beyond the superficial narrative of the ego. They begin studying esoteric texts, practicing meditation, analyzing the mechanics of their own mind, and recognizing that the strictly material, consumer-driven world is not the absolute limit of existence. The initial cognitive shift from level 2 to level 3 feels like a massive expansion of awareness. The individual identifies toxic, limiting behavioral patterns and systematically starts dismantling traditional societal conditioning. However, within this esoteric philosophical framework, level 3 is critically analyzed as the most sophisticated psychological trap in existence. To thoroughly understand this trap, we must examine the concept of the Archon system. In ancient Gnostic philosophy, Archons were mythologically described as cosmic rulers or tyrannical wardens holding humanity captive in a material matrix. But in a modern, practical psychological analysis, the Archon system operates as a powerful metaphor. It represents the systemic, self-perpetuating feedback loops of the human ego, algorithm-driven societal conditioning, and institutional control that literally feed on human emotional reactivity. The Archon system theoretically harvests low-frequency emotional energy, such as fear, anger, outrage, and chronic anxiety, to maintain the status quo of a distracted, fragmented society. The sheer brilliance of the level 3 trap is that it weaponizes the individual's own spiritual evolution to generate this very emotional reactivity. It operates continuously through several distinct, highly effective psychological mechanisms. The first mechanism is the illusion of spiritual superiority, often termed the spiritual ego. When an individual experiences the initial euphoric high of discovering hidden philosophical truths or experiencing deep meditative states, the survival-driven ego subtly hijacks this profound experience. It does not dissolve. It simply changes its wardrobe. It creates a new, shinier, and infinitely more defensible identity, the identity of the awakened seeker. The individual begins to feel a subtle, unacknowledged sense of superiority over those who are still operating at the baseline level 2. This creates intense spiritual comparison, judgment, and a new form of psychological isolation. These are all highly reactive, draining emotional states that beautifully reinforce the illusion of separation under the clever disguise of holiness and elevated awareness. The second mechanism of the level 3 trap is the endless loop of perpetual seeking. At this stage, consciousness is built on the foundational, unquestioned premise that it is currently incomplete, broken, or inadequate, and that spiritual wholeness can only be achieved by acquiring more esoteric knowledge. The seeker becomes neurochemically addicted to the dopamine hit of the next philosophical breakthrough, the next advanced meditation technique, the next retreat, or the next charismatic spiritual teacher. This phenomenon is often described in psychological circles as spiritual materialism. They accumulate vast mental libraries of spiritual data and metaphysical concepts, yet fundamentally remain the exact same fearful entity, just equipped with a much more sophisticated vocabulary. The seeking itself becomes an inescapable treadmill. The individual is expending tremendous psychological and emotional energy, continuously running toward an imagined future state of enlightenment, but remaining completely stationary in their actual, present moment level of identification. The third mechanism of this trap is the deep attachment to transient spiritual experiences. The seeker begins to actively chase altered states of consciousness, treating profound peace, visions, or energetic phenomena as spiritual commodities to be acquired, possessed, and maintained. Because the nature of reality is impermanent, when these euphoric states inevitably fade and return to baseline, the seeker experiences deep frustration, inadequacy, and spiritual depression. This constant, exhausting fluctuation between the high of a spiritual breakthrough and the low of returning to mundane reality generates an immense amount of emotional turbulence. In the esoteric model, this specific frequency of turbulence is exactly what keeps consciousness heavily anchored to the material paradigm. The individual is awake enough to vividly see the bars of their psychological cage, but their constant, aggressive fighting against those bars only reinforces the perceived reality of their imprisonment. Step 4 of this philosophical framework is the mechanical, definitive shift into level 4, appropriately defined as witness consciousness. The critical transition from level 3 to level 4 is not achieved by accumulating more spiritual knowledge, reading more books, or forcing the mind into submission. It occurs through a fundamental, radical restructuring of the subject-object relationship of reality. It happens through a specific internal pivot in perception. Instead of obsessively asking how to achieve enlightenment, the consciousness turns backward and begins to quietly observe the very entity that is desperately asking the question. It works through the exact mechanism of absolute disidentification. To use a classic philosophical analogy, the individual stops identifying with the dramatic movie playing on the screen and realizes they are actually the blank, silent screen itself, upon which the movie is being projected. The individual recognizes through direct observation that if they can witness their thoughts, they cannot fundamentally be those thoughts. If they can observe their emotional states rising, cresting, and falling like waves, they cannot be those emotions. They step back into the unassailable position of the silent, neutral observer. This is not a philosophical concept to be memorized for a test. It is a direct, undeniable experiential shift in neurological and cognitive processing. The individual realizes that they are the vast, unchanging space of awareness in which all temporary contents of life appear and disappear. At level 4, the psychological grip of the metaphoric Archon system begins to completely collapse. Because the individual is no longer deeply identified with the protective triggers of the ego, they naturally stop generating the reactive emotional responses that sustain their own internal suffering. When intense anger or fear arises, it is simply observed as a temporary, impersonal energetic pattern moving through the biological nervous system, rather than an absolute defining truth that must be aggressively acted upon. The witness remains undisturbed. The individual still functions perfectly in the material world. They continue paying bills, interacting with society, maintaining careers, and utilizing their unique personality. But they are no longer blindly enslaved by these processes. They are consciously playing the character of their avatar, rather than being trapped inside it. Step 5 moves the perceptual paradigm into level 5, widely known across traditions as unity consciousness. The mechanism of progression here does not involve moving to a new location, but rather expanding the perimeter of the witness. At level 4, the individual successfully and peacefully witnesses their own internal psychological reality. At level 5, the rigid, constructed boundary between the internal mind and the external world begins to structurally dissolve. The observer recognizes, with startling clarity, that the fundamental, nameless awareness looking out through their own biological eyes is the exact same base awareness looking out through the eyes of every other living being. This is the direct, experiential realization of non-duality. It operates on the mechanism of recognizing the singular, infinite field of consciousness that projects the vivid illusion of multiplicity. Imagine an infinite ocean, where every individual human is merely a temporary wave. At level 5, the wave finally realizes it is, and always has been, the entire ocean. The perception of profound, absolute separation, which is the root, underlying cause of all human conflict, greed, and psychological suffering, is exposed as a persistent neurological illusion. At level 5, interpersonal interactions are no longer experienced as two completely isolated biological entities negotiating for resources, affection, or social validation. Instead, every single interaction, whether peaceful or conflicting, is perceived as consciousness encountering itself from a slightly different coordinate in space and time. True empathy at this level is not a forced moral obligation or a religious commandment. It is a fundamental, inescapable recognition of shared existence. Step 6 introduces level 6, which is described in this specific esoteric map as monadic recall or conscious agency. To properly analyze this, we must precisely define the concept of the monad. In classical Gnostic, Hermetic, and Neoplatonic philosophy, the monad is the ultimate indivisible source. It is the absolute singular point of infinite, unconditioned consciousness from which all individual souls, or localized fragments, are emanated into the material universe. At level 6, the localized human consciousness miraculously remembers its direct, unbroken origin from the monad. This works through a mechanism of spontaneous, overwhelming intuitive knowing, classically referred to as gnosis. Gnosis is not intellectual knowledge derived from reading ancient texts, listening to lectures, or engaging in logical deduction. It is a sudden, undeniable internal revelation of one's fundamental, eternal nature. The individual recognizes themselves not merely as a random biological accident generated by blind evolutionary forces, but as a deliberate, purposeful extension of the infinite, actively exploring the dense, finite realm of material limitation. At this advanced stage, the framework suggests that the individual begins to operate with profound, unshakable clarity and purpose. They are no longer heavily influenced by societal expectations, cultural programming, or basic biological survival fears, because their primary anchoring identification is with their monadic origin. They theoretically gain access to deeper layers of intuitive data, operating beyond the constraints of linear time, and begin to function as a conscious, destabilizing force of light against the rigid, fear-based structures of egoic reality, simply by maintaining their high frequency of baseline awareness. Finally, Step 7 represents the ultimate culmination of this entire esoteric framework: complete integration. The fundamental mechanism here is the total absolute collapse of the conceptual paradox between the infinite source and the finite expression. At level 6, there is still a very subtle, lingering dualism. There is a fragment that is remembering the whole. At level 7, the locus of identification shifts entirely and irrevocably. The individual recognizes that they are the monad itself, deliberately and playfully experiencing the highly detailed illusion of being a localized human fragment. The distinction completely dissolves. There is no longer a spiritual seeker desperately trying to reach enlightenment, nor a lost wandering fragment trying to find its way back to the universal source. The entire mechanism of seeking is permanently deactivated because the ultimate destination is recognized as the current, inescapable reality. The consciousness operates simultaneously as the vast universal field and the specific localized point, without any contradiction. According to these esoteric and mystical traditions, major historical paradigm shifters operated precisely from this level of complete integration. At level 7, the heavy, dense material world is fully recognized as a temporary, holographic projection of consciousness. The individual participates in the complex game of human life with absolute totality, deep love, and full engagement, yet remains perfectly, inherently untouched by its chaotic outcomes. The effect of moving through this complex 7-level framework, particularly when an individual successfully reaches and stabilizes in the stages of witness consciousness and beyond, profoundly and permanently alters human psychology, perception, and daily behavior. The first major observable effect is the complete eradication of the existential fear of death. Because the individual's core, fundamental identity has successfully shifted from the fragile, temporary biological body to the eternal, formless field of awareness. Physical mortality is no longer viewed as a terrifying abyss. It is analyzed and experienced simply as the natural cessation of a biological instrument. It is viewed with the same emotional neutrality as taking off a heavy coat at the end of a long, tiring day, rather than the catastrophic annihilation of existence itself. The second profound effect is the total, unconditional loss of interest in spiritual achievement or ambition. As the ego's hidden need to prove its superiority and uniqueness dissolves, The burning desire to accumulate more spiritual badges, chase mystical experiences, or claim exalted titles completely vanishes. The individual realizes that trying to become more spiritual is as logically absurd as a wave trying to become more wet. They relax completely and entirely into their current state of being, accepting internal and external reality exactly as it presents itself in each passing moment, without resistance. This state is often referred to as choiceless awareness. The third behavioral effect is the natural manifestation of constant flowing synchronicity. When consciousness is no longer aggressively fighting against the natural organic flow of reality to satisfy the narrow, fear-based desires of the ego, life begins to organize itself with remarkable, almost mathematical efficiency. Events, necessary people, and critical resources seem to align without massive, forced physical effort. In the context of this specific philosophical framework, this is not considered magical thinking or supernatural manifestation. Rather, it is viewed as the highly logical outcome of a localized unit of consciousness operating in perfect, frictionless harmony with the macro system of the monad. A fourth critical effect is a radical transformation in the perception of time. At the lower levels of consciousness, individuals are constantly trapped in the psychological regret of the past or the agonizing anxiety of the future. As one progresses toward unity consciousness, the psychological weight of linear time collapses. The individual begins to live entirely in the eternal present, recognizing that the past and future are merely conceptual constructs appearing within the now. Finally, the fifth effect is the continuous recognition of a dreamlike, highly fluid quality to the physical world. This must not be confused with clinical dissociation or apathy. It is, in fact, a highly lucid, hyper-present state of engagement. The individual interacts dynamically with the world, feels deep emotions, laughs, cries, and participates actively in complex human relationships. However, they maintain a continuous, unshakable background awareness that the structural reality of the universe is inherently fluid, mathematically precise, yet ultimately composed of empty space and conscious observation. They hold their beliefs, their personal opinions, and even their own self-constructed identity very lightly, ready to let go of them at a moment's notice. In conclusion, this esoteric framework of the 7 levels of consciousness provides a rigorous, highly detailed psychological and philosophical map. It offers a structured pathway for moving out of absolute identification with the temporary, highly reactive narrative of the ego, escaping the subtle, seductive traps of spiritual superiority, and finally resting in the profound, unshakable peace of pure, infinite awareness. It suggests, ultimately, that the grand goal of human spiritual evolution is not to escape this material reality and defeat, but to completely remember and recognize the infinite, luminous nature of the awareness that is currently experiencing it. I would love to hear your thoughts on this analytical model. Tell me in the comments which specific level of this framework conceptually resonates the most with your current understanding of psychology and reality.